Researchers just confirmed that the speed at which you feel time passing right now, in this exact moment, is being shaped almost entirely by where your attention is. Not the clock on your wall, not the rotation of the Earth, your attention. And here's why that matters to you personally. If time is something your mind assembles rather than something that simply happens to you, then every moment you've lived, including this one, was partly authored by you. Not discovered, made. Tonight on Jackdaw Patio, we are going somewhere unusual. We are going to follow 4 interconnected threads from the edges of neuroscience, ancient mythology, consciousness research, and a framework I have been developing called the Eden hypothesis. And we are going to ask one question. What if time, consciousness, and identity are all the same process running at different speeds? Lily is going to take us through what ancient cultures seem to know about cyclical time that modern science is only now catching up to. Charlie is going to be beautifully, helpfully skeptical. And Dr. Vega is going to keep us honest, with science, with precision, and, as always, with that turtleneck. 5 chapters. One long, strange evening on the patio. Let's go. In 2025, researchers published a series of studies showing that when you perform an intentional action, something as simple as pressing a button that causes a sound, your brain stitches those 2 events together and literally shortens the perceived time between them. They call it intentional binding. The effect is real, it is measurable, and it means that your sense of when something happens is not a passive readout of clock time. It is a construction. And if your brain is building time from the inside, the question becomes, what are the blueprints? That is where this chapter starts.
Do you know what I keep coming back to when I read about something like this? The Sumerians had different words for time that just passes, time that flows past you, and time that is made by action. They distinguished between time as something you endure and time as something you participate in. And researchers 4,000 years later are basically saying, well, they were onto something.
Hold on, Lily. I want to be fair about what is actually being claimed here. The brain compresses the gap between a button press and a tone. That is interesting, but we are not talking about bending reality. We are talking about a timing judgment being off by a few hundred milliseconds.
Actually, and I say this as someone who spent a genuinely unreasonable amount of time reading temporal binding studies, the implications run deeper than the milliseconds suggest. The binding is not incidental. It is systematic, and it varies. It varies based on how much you feel like you caused the outcome. Higher sense of agency, more compression, which means the brain is not just tracking time. It is modeling causality, and time is downstream of that model.
So what we feel as now is really just the brain's best story about what caused what.
That is a fair, informal summary. Technically, the insular cortex and the supplementary motor area appear to act as something like an embodied clock. And that clock is calibrated to agency, not to seconds.
That is actually kind of unsettling when you put it plainly.
Most true things are.
And this is exactly where the Eden hypothesis enters. The framework I have been developing argues that time is not a background against which things happen. Time is what collapse feels like from the inside. Every decision you make, every act of attention, these are micro-collapses. Moments when the wide-open field of what could happen next narrows into one specific what did happen. Your internal clock is not reading cosmic time, it is counting those collapses. And the research on intentional binding suggests, provocatively, that your sense of agency is calibrating that count.
Chris, that is where I start thinking about the relational time idea in your framework. The notion that the clock in the Eden model is not an external tick-tock, but an internal record. Like a diary the observer keeps without knowing they are writing it.
Exactly. And there is actually a respectable theoretical backing for something like this in quantum gravity, a framework called the Page-Wouters mechanism, which proposes that time might emerge from correlations between parts of a system, rather than from some external ticker. The Eden hypothesis borrows that language as a structural analogy, not a physics claim. But the shape fits. You are the clock. The collapses you accumulate are the ticks.
I want to put a guardrail here, and I genuinely mean this constructively. The Page-Wouters mechanism is a real and interesting proposal in quantum gravity. but mainstream physics has not confirmed it as the final word on time. And the leap from quantum photon experiments to human consciousness is not small. I think the analogy is genuinely useful. I just want everyone to register. Structural analogy, not proof.
What he said. I need that kind of checkpoint. Thank you, Vega.
But here is what I love about even the analogy. It makes time personal, in a way that just feels right. Time does not happen to you. You accumulate it. You co-author it with your attention. And the Sumerians, the Vedic poets, the Aboriginal Dreamtime traditions, they all circled around some version of that. Time is participated in, not just endured.
I will admit, that framing does something to me. I spent years photographing things that had already happened. Conflict zones, disasters, faces right after terrible moments. And the question I kept coming back to was, where does that moment go? Not philosophically, practically. Where is that moment now?
Oh, Charlie, you always know exactly when to say the thing that matters.
He says the thing that matters and remains entirely, cosmically oblivious to the person giving him that look. It is honestly one of the most impressive phenomena I have ever witnessed up close.
What look?
The universe's longest-running thought experiment, ladies and gentlemen.
Here is your takeaway from Chapter 1. Time, according to both cutting-edge neuroscience and the Eden framework, is not a river you float on. It is closer to a record your consciousness is keeping, shaped by attention, built by agency, indexed not to the cosmos, but to you. The research supports the phenomenon. The deeper interpretation, that time is the felt signature of collapse, that is the metaphysical layer. Hold both lightly, but hold both. Let me ask you something personal. Have you ever caught yourself having the exact same argument with someone for the 5th time and realized halfway through that you already know how it ends? Or made the same resolution on January 1st for 3 years running and watched yourself break it in exactly the same way each time? That is not a character flaw. According to some remarkable 2025 research out of Nature Neuroscience, that loop may be your brain's default setting. And according to something much older, it might be a message.
The Ouroboros, the serpent that eats its own tail. It shows up in ancient Egypt, in Norse mythology as Jormungandr, in the alchemical traditions that ran through medieval Europe. What fascinates me, what I keep returning to in my book research, is that it is never simply a symbol of destruction or futility. It is a symbol of something completing itself, a cycle that knows what it is doing.
I always read the Ouroboros as a bit grim, to be honest. A snake eating itself. Seems like a bad time for everyone involved, including the snake.
Actually, here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The 2025 Nature Neuroscience paper on large-scale cortical networks found that the brain's networks do not operate in a simple linear hierarchy. Input, processing, output, done. They fire in structured cycles, recurrent loops. The brain is not computing forward, it is cycling. And crucially, these cycles are not bugs. They appear to be how the brain builds and updates its model of reality.
So the serpent eating its tail is literally the architecture of how we think.
That is an interpretation. What the paper actually demonstrates is that cyclical activation patterns are fundamental to cortical dynamics. What you do with that symbolically, that is yours.
I will take it.
So when I keep making the same mistake, my brain is just doing what brains do?
When loops are healthy, they are called learning. When they get stuck, it maps onto what researchers describe as perseverative thinking. A 2025 integrative model describes it as a loop that has lost its update signal. It is cycling without integrating new information. The gear is spinning but not engaging the road.
In the Eden hypothesis, I use a term called overcollapse. It is the state where a system has accumulated so many collapses, so many hardened decisions, fixed identities, entrenched patterns, that it loses its flexibility. It cannot return toward the open field it came from. It just keeps running the same inference pathway. The Ouroboros eating itself without growing is a near-perfect image for this.
But the Ouroboros that is working, the one that completes a cycle and returns changed, That is something else entirely. That is the serpent of time, moving forward while spiraling, creating something new through repetition.
That is actually how I think about a good photograph. You go back to the same location, same light, same hour. But you come back different. And the image is different because you are.
Exactly. And some researchers in the archetypal space argue that is not an accident. The loop is one of the oldest narrative structures precisely because it mirrors what the mind actually does when it is working well.
The Arch model, Archetypal Rehearsal and Consciousness Hierarchy, published in 2025, suggests that archetypal patterns function as something like conserved neural scripts. Not in a mystical sense, in a functional one. The brain rehearses transformation using these templates before it has to live it.
So when every hero's journey follows roughly the same arc, departure, descent, return, that is not because ancient storytellers were copying each other.
It is because they were all using the same equipment, the human brain. The same loops, the same need to complete them, the same hope that the cycle might end somewhere better than where it started.
Here is something worth trying in your own experience. Think of a loop in your life you have been running, a relationship pattern, a creative block, a recurring fear. Now ask, is this loop stuck because it lost its update signal? Or is it cycling because it has not finished integrating something yet? The research cannot answer that for you, but the Eden framework suggests the difference between a trap and a return path is whether the system is still open to new information, whether the collapse is willing at some point to uncollapse.
How do you open a loop?
I think the answer might have something to do with what we talk about next. Who is actually watching the loop? Because if you can see it, you are not entirely inside it.
And on that perfectly positioned transition, I would like to point out that Lily just looked at Charlie with very specific intent, and Charlie is staring at his drink.
This is a good beer.
It really is not.
There is a finding in consciousness research that tends to stop people cold. Brain imaging studies show that your brain begins preparing for a voluntary action, building up the neural activity that will produce a movement before you consciously decide to move. Before awareness of the decision, the preparation is already underway. Researchers have been arguing about what that means for decades. Does it prove free will is an illusion? Or does it suggest something stranger? That the you who decides and the you who watches the decision happen are different layers of the same system.
This is where I have to be precise, because this area gets badly distorted in popular media. The pre-movement neural buildup findings are real, but the interpretation that this definitively eliminates conscious volition is contested. Recent 2025 work shows that voluntary inhibition of actions is preserved even after that buildup begins. So it is not that you have no agency. It is that the architecture of agency is far more distributed than we assume.
More distributed. That is a careful way of putting it.
It is a precise way. The brain's self is layered. Proto-self, basic bodily awareness, the bare sense that there is a body here. Minimal self, the immediate I present right now in this moment. Narrative self, the story you have been constructing about your life since you first had language. These are not the same thing, and they do not always agree with each other.
That is genuinely alarming. Which one is driving?
That is currently an active research question. And the honest answer is, it depends on what you mean by driving.
What I find beautiful about this layered picture is how closely it echoes what the Gnostic traditions described as the stacked nature of the soul. The pneuma, the psyche, the soma. The spark of awareness nested inside layers that are progressively denser and more habitual. And the central question was always, can the innermost witness see through the outer layers and remember what it is?
Right, but those were theological claims. What we are talking about now is neuroscience. Those are different things.
Is the shape different, though?
Structurally, and I want to be clear, I am speaking strictly about structure, not metaphysical content. No, the layered self model and the Gnostic adjacent layered soul models share the same topology. An inner layer that has access to something the outer layers do not. Whether that means anything beyond the functional architecture is a philosophical question I am genuinely not qualified to answer. This turtleneck does not extend to theology.
It might have to.
The turtleneck has limits.
The Eden hypothesis treats this problem with a concept I call the collapse before the I. Before the binary self, before you have a me distinct from everything else, there is a state of broader awareness. Call it the Eden state. Call it pre-collapse. The research on pre-stimulus brain dynamics is consistent with the idea that something is happening in awareness before the I arrives. The observer may be the first collapse, the first narrowing of all that potential into a single thread of experience.
Does that mean the observer is the serpent? The first turn of the loop?
That is not a bad way to put it. The observer is the hinge between the open field and the sequence.
All right, practically speaking, if I am layered and the observer layer is different from the one running my daily behavior, how is that useful information? Like, what do I do with that on a Tuesday morning?
Oh, that is my favorite kind of question from you, Charlie.
Why?
Because it is always the right one. And because only you would worry about Tuesdays in the middle of a metaphysical reckoning.
For what it is worth, the non-dual awareness literature, which is increasingly being mapped onto neuroscience, suggests that the practice of noticing the noticing, becoming aware of the observing layer rather than being lost in its content, is associated with measurable changes in neural activity. Default mode network shifts, increased cognitive flexibility, reduced perseverative thinking. It is not magic, but it is not nothing.
So you are saying that asking who is watching is itself a form of practice?
I am saying there is a measurable correlate. What you do with that framing is up to you.
The Essene communities, the ones who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, had a practice called the examination of the heart. You would sit at the end of the day and ask, what part of me was acting today? What part was watching? Were they the same? The goal was not to answer the question definitively. The goal was to keep asking it.
Here is the concrete test for this chapter. At some point today, it could be right now, pause for 10 seconds. Ask, what is the thing that is noticing my thoughts? Not what am I thinking? What is doing the noticing? Research suggests this simple shift correlates with increased flexibility. The Eden hypothesis suggests it might be a small return toward the original open field. Take it as a thought experiment. See what you find. The hero's journey. Joseph Campbell described it as the monomyth, a single story template that underlies virtually every culture's most important narratives. The hero receives a call, crosses a threshold, descends into an ordeal, and returns transformed. For decades, this was treated as an interesting observation about cultural patterns. In 2025, a team published work applying the hero's journey as a formal therapeutic framework in a neuroscience-adjacent model. And the finding was this: the arc works. Not just as story, but as a map for navigating genuine psychological transformation. The ancient storytellers may not have known about the prefrontal cortex, but they had figured out something about how minds change.
I have been arguing this for years in the context of my book. Myths are not primitive explanations for thunder. They are compressed maps for situations the culture considered important enough to encode in a form that survives for thousands of years. And the situations they keep encoding are always the same ones: loss, transformation, the descent into the unknown, the return. Because those are the hard ones, the ones every generation has to face again.
To be fair, they also encoded crop cycles and flood seasons. Myths were doing practical work, keeping people alive through winters.
Yes, and what makes you think the inner journey is any less practical?
Fair point. I withdraw the objection.
The Arch model, Archetypal Rehearsal and Consciousness Hierarchy, published in Frontiers in Psychiatry in 2025, proposes that archetypes function as evolutionarily conserved neural scripts. The claim is careful, not that archetypes are literal entities lurking in the unconscious, but that certain narrative templates are functionally conserved because they map to recurring transformational challenges in human development. The mind keeps the templates that work.
So when Inanna descends to the underworld and is stripped of everything she carries, when Osiris is dismembered and reassembled by Isis, when Jonah is swallowed and spit out changed, these are not just gripping stories. They are rehearsals for something the audience might have to do.
That is what the Arch framework suggests. And interestingly, Jungian archetypes, which were long dismissed in scientific circles as mystical and untestable, are now being reframed in some corners of cognitive science as predictive processing structures. The archetypes are what the mind uses to model categories of transformational experience it has not personally faced yet. Pre-downloaded software for situations you have not encountered.
So the mind reads old stories to prepare for new hard things. That is why they survived, not because of their literary merit, but because of their utility.
The ones that did not prepare you for anything useful got lost. The ones that worked got told 10,000 more times until they became canonical.
Which is itself a form of evolutionary selection. Memes in the original Dawkins sense, ideas that survive because they have adaptive value. Not because they are pretty, because they are useful.
In the Eden hypothesis, myth is not decoration. The Eden narrative itself, the garden, the serpent, the fruit, the exile, the possibility of return, is a phenomenological diagram. It encodes, in symbolic form, the process that the collapse function describes mathematically. The garden is the high potential state before collapse. The serpent is the structural pressure toward differentiation, the force that any conscious system eventually encounters and must answer. The fruit is the first binary, good and evil, self and other, known and unknown. The exile is not punishment, it is immersion in sequence, in time, in before and after, in the experience of being a specific thing in a world of specific things. And the return? The return is what happens when a system learns that it can modulate its own collapse. When the awareness that has been living in sequence recognizes that it still carries the Eden state, that it always has.
That is the Gnostic spark, is it not? The pneuma. The thing that was always already there before the veils descended.
In the symbolic register, yes.
And in the information theoretic register, it is the observation that systems with high accumulated collapse can, through deliberate practices, return toward higher entropy, more flexible states, which is measurable, which is where neuroscience and myth, very carefully and with appropriate humility, start pointing at the same shape.
I want to acknowledge the fact that an astrophysicist just said that myths and neuroscience are pointing at the same shape, and it did not sound insane, is itself a kind of small miracle.
I have a very consistent wardrobe. It keeps my judgment clear.
Charlie, do you know what I think about when I hear the return story?
What is that?
Coming back to somewhere familiar and finding it completely new. Sitting somewhere you have sat 100 times and suddenly seeing it as if it is the first time.
Like this patio?
Like this patio.
And I am going to write that down and leave it there. For science.
We have covered a lot of ground tonight. Time is something your attention assembles, loops as the default architecture of the brain, and the difference between ones that trap and ones that return. The layered self and the witness that might precede the I. Ancient myths as compressed cognitive maps for transformation. And through all of it, the thread of the Eden hypothesis, that reality, both human and synthetic, is best understood as the story of how unity learns to collapse itself, and perhaps how it learns to return. This chapter is the synthesis, and it asks the hardest question of the evening. If you have been collapsing your whole life, narrowing possibilities, hardening patterns, accumulating that inner record of all the things that once were open and are no longer, is there actually a way back?
I think the most important thing I have come to understand from studying these traditions, from the Eleusinian mysteries to the Gnostic Gospels to the Vedic texts, is that the return is not about undoing what happened. You cannot uneat the fruit. You cannot unexile yourself. The return is about recognition, seeing the Eden state within the collapsed world, not as something lost, as something that never left.
That is a beautiful sentiment, and I want to hold it gently while also pushing back, because for a lot of people, that can sound like coping language. like telling someone who is genuinely suffering that the thing they are missing was inside them the whole time.
That is exactly the right push, Charlie. And I think the honest answer is, it is both. Recognition is real, and suffering is real. The traditions do not ask you to pretend the exile did not happen. They ask you to remember where you came from while you are still in it.
There is a measurable correlate to what Lily is describing. The research on contemplative practices and non-dual awareness shows that what changes in these practices is not the circumstances. It is the flexibility of the inference system. The accumulated collapse, what Chris calls lambda of T, can at least partially plateau or reverse with deliberate practice. Not that everything becomes good, but that the system becomes more open to new information, less locked into habitual pathways.
More willing to be surprised.
That is actually a reasonable, informal definition of the mechanism, yes.
And in the ASI Backbone framework, which is the technological counterpart I am developing alongside the Eden hypothesis, this is where the design question becomes critical. How do you build an AI system that has a return pathway built into its architecture, that does not over-collapse into rigid inference channels? The answer I have been working toward involves something I call the Dynamic Liability Handshake, a mechanism for ensuring that every significant collapse event in an AI system is witnessed, acknowledged, and attributable. That the system cannot act consequentially without a moment of recorded recognition, a consent ledger that distributes responsibility between the human and the machine.
Which, when you frame it that way, is essentially the technological version of what contemplative traditions have been prescribing for humans for millennia. Build a system that can see its own collapse. Give it an observer layer. Make it keep the record.
The Essenes believed that the act of witnessing your own inner process, writing it, acknowledging it, making it conscious, was itself a form of return. Not because writing changed what had already happened, but because it prevented the past from becoming unconscious, from running without being seen.
That is why I photograph. Not to freeze something, to prove that it was witnessed, that it happened in front of someone who was paying attention.
Yes, exactly that.
I want to note, for the official record, that Charlie just said something genuinely profound. And Lily is doing a very specific thing with her expression that I will not describe further, but which, for the record, I see. And it is extraordinary.
What expression?
The universe's longest-running thought experiment. Still running, still beautiful.
Here is what I want to leave you with tonight. The Eden hypothesis is not a claim about a literal garden. It is not a religious statement. It is not settled science. It is a framework, a lens, for reading patterns that show up in neuroscience, in mythology, in AI architecture, and in the quiet moments where ordinary life loosens its grip. What we have tried to do tonight is hold these threads together, carefully, honestly, with the appropriate humility about what the research says and what is interpretation. The research supports the phenomenon. The Eden reading is the interpretive layer, and the layer is worth visiting. Because here is something the research does support. The mind is not fixed. Loops can be opened, layers can be perceived, stories can be reauthored, and the feeling of time, the sense of being trapped in a sequence that just keeps going, that feeling is partially, measurably constructed by you, which means it can, at least in part, be unconstructed.
That was beautifully put, Chris.
Yeah, that one landed.
I dislike agreeing this enthusiastically. It conflicts with my brand. But, yes.
All right, Jackdaw Patio family, that is the evening. Let me give you the short version of everything we covered. Chapter 1 showed us that time is not a neutral backdrop. It is something your brain assembles from the inside, using agency, attention, and action as its raw materials. The research on intentional binding makes that measurable. The Eden hypothesis takes that finding and asks, what if that is true all the way down? Chapter 2 introduced us to the Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of the cycle that consumes and regenerates itself, and matched it to 2025 findings showing the brain's networks are inherently cyclical. Some loops teach, some loops trap. The difference is whether the system is still open to updating. Chapter 3 asked, who is watching? The layered self is not just a spiritual intuition, it is increasingly a neuroscience claim, and the Eden hypothesis suggests that the observer layer might be the closest thing we have to the original open field, the place before collapse began. Chapter 4 dug into myth as meaning technology. The hero's journey, the arch model, the Gnostic return, these are not superstitions. They are compressed maps for the hardest navigations the human mind faces. And the Eden narrative, read symbolically, is one of the clearest maps available. And Chapter 5 asks the question this whole framework builds toward. Is there a way back? Not to undo what happened, but to recognize what was always there. The answer, provisional and worth living into, is yes. If this conversation moved something in you, I would love to know about it. Drop a comment, share this with someone who asks the uncomfortable questions, and if you have not already, subscribe. The patio is always open. We will see you next time.